Ready?
Yeah, already.
Okay, well, hello everybody. It's good to see you all here this afternoon, and hello to everyone online as well. I'm Jack Trope. I'm the Senior Director in the Indian Child Welfare Program at KC Family Programs, and I'll be moderating this panel. On our panel, we have Kimberly Cluff, who's the Legal Director for the California Tribal Family Coalition, Tammy Andrade, the ICWA Specialist for the Bishop Paiute Tribe, Chairperson Janet Gill, who is with the Picayune Rancheria of Chukchansi Indians. And so thank you for joining us today. I will just start with a very brief introduction. So this panel is about use of tribal attorneys and case for legal counsel for tribes. And we know across the country that ICWA implementation is a challenge. And we know from national data that the removal rate of Native Americans is 3 times any other, 3 times the national average. We know that 57% of placements are still with non-Native families. So we know there's a lot of work to be done around ICWA implementation. And we also know that data around the Indian Child Welfare Act, unfortunately, is limited. But some of the new data that's been generated, we've started to learn some things. And what we know is that when tribal representation is present across the board, there is better compliance with the Indian Child Welfare Act. We know that the time to permanency is shorter, or at least the initial data is suggesting that. It's not comprehensive data to be sure, but certainly very interesting data. We know that the time to return home in these new studies is shorter when the tribe is present in the case from the beginning. So tribal representation is critical if it was going to work the way it's supposed to, the way we all know it needs to operate. But of course, the quality of tribal representation or the extent of tribal representation can vary tremendously. And we know sometimes it can be just a social worker who has many, many cases on his or her docket, who is calling in by phone. The judge might listen to what the worker has to say for 2 minutes and then is talking to everybody else in the courtroom. And we hope that the tribal input has some impact, but it's a much more limited amount. We know in other cases, obviously we have social workers who are now Zoom era, maybe on Zoom or in person, and certainly, that's always, not always, but usually often more effective than more limited participation, right? But it's always, when a social worker is there, it's frequently up to the judge. What role is the social worker going to be allowed to play? How often is he or she going to be allowed to participate or talk, right? So although we know that tribal social workers do amazing work and really impact a lot of cases, and still there's still often limitations to, in many courts at least, what social workers can do. And so really, when we think about what's the gold standard of tribal participation, it's going to be when the full team is there. And there's not only the social worker and even a QEW perhaps, and maybe a tribal leader involved in some way, but also an attorney involved as part of that team, and an attorney that the judge has to listen to in the same way that other attorneys are listened to in courtroom. So again, this is about how do we effectively make sure that tribal voice is heard in these cases, so we can get better outcomes in these cases, and that ICWA is applied the way it's supposed to be. So with that introduction, I'd like to turn it over to Kimberly, who will take it home.
Thank you. Thanks, Seth. All right. So when the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed, it was before the era of federal statutes and federal funding for parents' counsel, even for minors' counsel. And there are even states today in the United States where parents, for example, don't get legal counsel to the extent that in California they do. We have states where there are kids that don't get counsel. In California, we're lucky. We are a state where parents do get counsel. In fact, that counsel reaches sometimes beyond into, let's say, de facto parents on occasion get appointed counsel. We've seen foster parents come in with counsel, but we know that when the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed, it did not include provision for counsel for tribes. So I want to talk through a little bit of just framing out the issue. And I also want to figure out how to advance my slides. Okay, so the problem, when a child is removed from their family and they enter into this thing we call the foster care system or the child welfare system, that means that their fate, what happens to them, is in the hands of the court. Now, ideally, if this is an ICWA case, we're in tribal court, right? That is our ideal. But we also know that when the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed, it creates, for example, an automatic right to veto by a parent. Really not something that we get to litigate. If a parent says no, the answer is no. Case is not going to transfer. So we are left with the state court systems. Everyone in the state court systems is entitled to have an appointed attorney to represent them, except in the case that involves an Indian child, because there is a party that under the law can, there's a tribe that under the law can be a party, but there is no provision under state or federal statutes to provide public funds for that lawyer. So what that means is that despite the tribe's incredibly important role in that child's future, despite the tribe being sometimes the unit that's going to be bringing the most impactful services to the family, the unit that's most likely to find, for example, substitute care providers for that kiddo, despite it being the tribal social worker or the tribal representative who's going to be doing the vast majority of the reunification services, the tribe is still at a fundamental inequity because everybody else in that courtroom has a publicly funded attorney and tribes do not. So what does that mean? It leaves a tribal social worker often the only voice in the courtroom trying to preserve that child's relationship with their tribe and with their tribal community, and the only party in the courtroom who is trying to defend those complex rights of the tribe. Now, why wouldn't everybody else in the courtroom be working on defending the complex rights of the tribe? Say the Parents Council, wouldn't they have an interest, right? Because the Indian Child Welfare Act, for example, provides active efforts to the Native parent, the Indian parent, who could be Native or non-Native. So why wouldn't the Parents Council be feeling like it's very important to protect those complex rights of the tribe? Well, one reason is I've spoken to many Parents Council. They get a very small number of ICWA cases per year, for example. And so they are oftentimes not highly educated on the Indian Child Welfare Act. They find themselves playing catch up. Same with Minors Council. And we hear that from bench officers as well. Very well meaning, they want to do the right thing, but this is the third ICWA case they've had, or the fifth ICWA case, and there's been hundreds of cases in between. So what happens is it puts the person who's there on behalf of the tribe as really one of the key voices for everything ICWA in that courtroom. And so that puts an extra emphasis on the fact that that party, that the tribal party, is having to educate everybody in that courtroom over and over and over again. And I know that some of you as advocates have had in-depth conversations about the Indian Child Welfare Act in the hallway, where you find yourself trying to get folks caught up, trying to say, no, this is how it works, this is the act. Many, many times those hallway conversations are really, really critical. And there's also conversations that happen, let's say, there's some court calendars that run, let's say, a calendar check in the morning, right? And critical conversations are happening there, getting the court to understand what's happening in a case. It's so those conversations and that instant ability to convince the court, hey, this is really important, that happens very quickly. And then there's another piece, which is that there are lots of times in a court case where there's a record that needs to be preserved, for example, right? So we've got to preserve the record because there's going to be an appeal. I want to talk about appeals for just a second, and I'll come back to it. California on the Indian Child Welfare Act has more appeals than every other state in the United States combined by a factor of 2. California is the place where ICWA is appealed the most by such a distance. Why is that? Number one, we don't know for sure why that's the case, but we can probably guess a little bit, right? Huge relocation state. We have lots and lots of kiddos and families that are from out of state. Lots of families that unfortunately have through the policies of the federal and state government been distanced from their community. And so when they find themselves in the court system, it's like, wait, my family's from Oklahoma. So there's a big lift there with our out-of-state tribal families. One of the other reasons I think we have such a high number of appeals in California is that people like all of you, lots of people have done tons of training, right? So there's a knowledge that ICWA is out there, but we have tremendous turnover, for example. And so there's knowledge, but we don't quite get it right. So we have a lot of parents attorneys and minors attorneys who ICWA is a key thing in their mind. They don't quite get it necessarily. So they are filing appeals. There's lots of complex reasons why we have that. One outcome of having all of those appeals, unfortunately, is that folks are frustrated. Oh, these ICWA cases get appealed over and over again. The vast majority, upwards of 70% of those appeals, are an inquiry and notice. They're at the very beginning of a case. That's where we're missing it in California. So this is creating a system of using a lot of judicial resources. It's frustrating folks. It's creating a huge kind of legacy of ICWA's not working very well in California. So we really need to get to the root. How do we make ICWA work better? Another result of not having legal counsel is this elongated court proceedings. And Jack mentioned it, that there's a study out there, very interesting to me. There needs to be more. We are at a huge lack of data. But one of the key takeaways is called the baseline study. I encourage anybody to take a look at it. One of the key findings in that study is that where a tribe is involved early in a case, you decrease the number of days a Native child spends in care by like 100 days, which for a little one, that's a lot. To go from 400 days in care to 300 days in care is a really big deal. And the data point that causes that reduction is early involvement of tribes, which is, right, so it's like we have data that tells us one of the solutions to one big problem with Native kids, which is these elongated cases. So boy, we have an obligation to jump on that data point. All right, so legal counsel for tribes, the concept is, hey, we need to use existing public funding, right? Because the federal government and the state government, they already fund legal counsel for parents and for kiddos and for the county. Let's make sure that tribes have equal access to that resource so that we can deal with this inequity. A really important piece is to create this level playing field in the courtroom, saving time, and that's time in care, but that's also time for all parties. That's time spent on appeals and judicial resources, very, very important. The other piece that is really interesting is that if California, right, we're at the forefront of a lot of these ICWA issues by virtue of appeals, for example. And I say this cautiously. How did the Brackeen case get going? It's an appeal, right? It's a case out of Texas that was appealed. Every time you plant a seed of an appeal, you plant a possible Brackeen case. We have an obligation to decrease the chances of the next Brackeen case coming out of California. How do we do that? We decrease the number of appeals. Every time a court is seeing an ICWA case on appeal, there is a danger. And when you have in California, let's say 210 ICWA appeals in a year, and in Arizona you have 8, something is not right. We've got to figure out a solution. And then another piece is that by having really robust resources for legal counsel for tribes, we're creating a landscape where we're bringing up attorneys and resources. We're bringing resources into California. We're developing those resources in non-Native and Native law students to become the next advocates of tomorrow, to be a really rich training ground, to take those legal resources that, for example, tribes have supported, organizations have supported. Let's get Native kids into law school. Let's get them through. Let's create advocates coming out of community. If you do that, and then you have a place for them to land, and they have a really robust ability to step in and do advocacy on behalf of tribes, that's a good thing. It's a good thing for tribes. It's a good thing for the system. So I want to talk about a project in Alaska A former colleague is Native Alaskan, and he went back home up to Alaska, and he started what is called ANJC, the Alaska Native Justice Center. And it's it's under the auspices of the Cook Inlet tribe. And this is one excerpt of a presentation that his name is Alex Cleghorn, they did a report on their work. So what they did in Alaska at the ANJC is they said, hey, we have all these villages that are coming and they don't have legal counsel, and we see a problem. We need to try to find a resource to empower them, create a resource that Native Alaskan villages can have legal counsel when they need it at no cost. They came up with really interesting data. This is just one piece. Again, I encourage folks to take a look at it. So statewide, they had 31 to 37% of Native kids not in preferred placements under ICWA in 2005 and 2019. They even had a higher percentage not in ICWA compliant placements in Anchorage, in the urban center of Alaska. In the cases that ANJC handled, only 21% of their cases were out of placement preference. That's a huge difference to be able to make sure to be there to advocate for compliance with the placement preferences under the Act. The difference between the rate at which kiddos were not in placement to when they decreased that rate of being in placement, out of placement only in 21%, the difference, only factor that changed, was having attorneys in court with those Alaska Native representatives, with the advocates who were doing their job, advocating for those placements, finding those placements, and then having the backup of an attorney who has their back, who can make sure that if the court questions that placement preference, which, right, the most common challenge to a placement issue is, well, you know, the child has been with this non-compliant placement for so long, and it's very, you know, we don't want to disrupt. That's the reason for non-ICWA compliant placements we see the most. And being able to go in and brief that and set it for trial and get that kiddo moved. And that's what they have been able to do. So I think that there's a lot of other data that has come out. It's a relatively small data set. It's a new project, ANJC, but they are developing data. And that's another piece that for looking at this, we know that the data that comes out of the state of California is wrong, just plain and simple, right? The state's data is wrong. And if there's anybody from the state here, I would say that with Stephanie Weldon sitting here, I'd say that with Kim Johnson sitting here, right? The data is wrong. We talk to UC Berkeley on a pretty regular basis about that data, and they know that it's wrong. How do we get better data? Well, we've had conversations for years, gosh, more than a decade, about how there's a need to develop data from the Native community to be able to counteract the bad data that comes from the state. And watching how Alex's project has been able to really compile some data. Again, it's a relatively small subset, but they are figuring out the data piece that then is able to go, they're able to go back to Cook Inlet, they're able to go back to courts and say, hey, we've got some data that really, really tells the story, is very powerful. Unfortunately, so many policy decisions are based on data. And I say unfortunately, I mean, there's data that can be super helpful that we look for, that we want. But boy, if you get data that's wrong, it tells the wrong story. And so it's really important to be working on data. So that's another element that has come out of Alaska that I think is really interesting. So that is all of the slides I wanted to share. So CTFC has been working on a project to stand up the ability to have legal counsel for tribes available so that no tribe in California doesn't have access to legal counsel in their ICWA cases. That is the goal. The goal, and boy, we have it printed on t-shirts, right? It's every tribe, every child, every case, so that there's no tribe that finds itself unable to have legal counsel. Now, there's always going to be tribes that have their legal counsel, and that's fantastic. The goal is to shrink the pool of tribes that have zero access to legal counsel. Out of the 109 tribes in California, we want to be sure that all 109, whatever is the right fit for them, there's none that say, we simply can't, we don't have a resource. There is no resource for us. So that is the goal. And looking at what's been happening in Alaska really gives a lot of hope that we're on the right track. And working with legislators and talking with tribal leaders, we know we're on the right track. And so that's the goal right now. And that's kind of the big picture of where we are. I'm going to hand it over to Tammy. And it's been such a pleasure to work with Tammy out in Bishop. And so Tammy, I'm going to ask you to just talk about your impressions.
Good afternoon. My name is Tammy Andrade. I'm from Bishop, California. I work for the Bishop Paiute Tribe Social Services program as an ICWA specialist, and I currently have been working with CTFC for the past, I'd say, over a year now. And you know, I just want to say that when I first came to this position as an ICWA specialist, I had no guidance. So it was very hard, and I was unsure about what my role was, especially in the courtroom. So now, having, you know, them on board and working closely with the tribe, I am able to, you know, Micah's in the courtroom with me every time I'm at court. So I mean, there's been so many times that I've just had to like say, I don't know, or I'll find out, because I didn't know, you know, what to do in those cases. But having them present has been a huge stress reliever on my, you know, part. And let's see, what else? Oh yeah, we've been able to, so we've had, in April, we provided a QEW training, a virtual one, and then we did it on site, which we had a really good turnout. So we have like a handful of QEWs now that are trained. And we did bring a couple with us that attended the training because they want to know and learn more about the ICWA program. So from there, we also have scheduled this month, later on this month, resource family foster care kind of recruitment training for our community. We do have several Native families in our community, but most of the time they're, you know, full, so we don't have a whole lot to choose from. So we're doing this recruitment kind of training. And then we're also doing a training with the Inyo County court, judges, attorneys, the CPS, social workers, tribal folks. Let's see. And you know, I heard the gentleman earlier today in the conference ask, how do we educate the county? Well, this is a perfect example of how we're doing that. In our county, we have a really good relationship with them. So, but there are the times where they have questions or they're not sure. So that's when we could rely on CTFC.
Thanks, Tammy.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jen. I'm the chairperson for the Picayune, Rancheria, the Chukchansi Indian. And whenever I speak, I always like to know who's in my room. So for those of you in the room, see a show of hands or who are tribal leaders in the room. You guys can raise your hands up. And what about our tribal advocates? How many tribal representatives do we have? I said tribal advocates, so everyone should have their hand. What about for state? How many state or county representatives? Okay, well, good to know. Well, first off, I just want to say thank you for not only attending the session today, but for truly advocating for all of our tribal families, and so for all the work that you do in use of that. Today, I've been asked to discuss my experience as a tribal leader and the importance of providing legal counsel to tribes and say their things. So first off, I do want to preface my comments by acknowledging that we have amazing and truly dedicated advocates throughout the state, and my comments should in no way be construed as advocating for them to be completely removed from the legal process. Again, they play a major part, and so this is just legal counsel for tribes, and I see that more as legal counsel being part of the to ensure compliance, not necessarily replacing anyone within the call. So as tribal leaders, we have a collective responsibility really for protecting our children, upholding our tribal sovereignty, and preserving our culture for future generations. So ensuring ICWA compliance in state courts truly falls and squarely falls within that responsibility. So as has already been mentioned by my colleagues, that is something that we legal counsel equity within our state court cases. And it's really incumbent upon our tribal leaders to provide necessary legal resources to kind of really to ensure kind of impacting on the Kimberly's report on ensuring our tribal rights to notice, intervention, virtual payments, and ensuring our communication, question witnesses, etc. are being approached. Not saying that tribal identity cannot do that. I was preparing for this session, and I reached out to our just reminding me as their tribal leader of all the other roles they play in the dependency process. Now they have just started with located placement, permitting reviews, recruitment, attracting homes, provided info services for families and children, participation in county and state meetings, advocate and implementation, among other duties that we have to do. For us, they're truly stretched thin and constantly struggling to find a way to keep up. And really, it's out of their year, we should be supporting legal counsel so that our legal counsel can be stepping in our court cases and therefore taking the burden off of victims who are really feeling one face with our families. And so that was really enlightening for me and for everyone. No, we do have legal counsel. It is a third party that we use. And we have it very helpful. I think most of the time, they've been working with Kimberly and now part of the CTFC board. We truly made that transition because before we did, we would have kids going to all of our cases and our director and 2022 experience because she was finding it overwhelming from the increase in helpful to see more so what are the other things I just wanted to mention once again highlight effort. As you know, just because we have legal counsel there does not mean that they are influenced. Understanding the law and Jewish reports. So again, it would also be for her to have years of experience to also it's not necessarily again, I'm looking at all of them. It's I don't believe it. Kind of having a discussion, but I will say just because I did go to law school recently, ICWA is a very niche area of law. There are not a lot of ICWA attorneys. So again, I would say all of our tribal leaders being advocates for that, looking at your local law schools that are around you and trying to partner with those law schools to at least provide a class on ICWA. I know when I went, I attended the University legal program, and we're very much tribal law. But we also didn't have ICWA class. We had ICWA segments, nothing completely just on ICWA comparing our students to go and advocate for our tribal children. This is a plug. I look at this leaders will reach out to the local school to see what they can do as far as collaborating with that. And also trying to get any law I would right now, anyone who's going to consider unlicensed in the state of California really would need them about to get involved in the education. On a personal level, you want to do nothing.
Thank you to our panelists for some excellent presentations. I'll just mention a couple of things though that struck me as you were talking. One is that you're talking about sort of two sides of how the system can be better. One is that upfront work, right? And so we see that sort of in the larger child welfare system through things like Family First and paying, starting to look at paying for more prevention services. But I think from a tribal perspective, that tribal involvement as early as possible. And it's social workers, ICWA workers working to impact decisions that are being made by the agency at the very, very front end. So I think that's one part of it. And then the other place we see efforts to try to improve things is in the court, right? By better representation in court. So we know, for instance, now there's a variety of questions now that are in the Child Welfare Manual of the Children's Bureau. So we now know that Parents Council and Children's Council are able to get funded through federal funding programs. There's a question in there also, question 31, that mentions tribal attorneys. So there's this recognition, right, that there are different points in this process that both need to be strengthened in the front end and in the courtroom to really get the kinds of results that we want. And not just, sometimes the word compliance isn't the right word, right? Because that just sounds like you're checking a bunch of boxes. It's getting the right outcomes for children and families in the system, Native children and families in the system. So with that, I'd like to open the floor for any questions for our panelists. Yes.
I'm working so on the journey with California. We do a lot of work for tribes.
Yeah.
We're creating for tribes that are income eligible. Really, my question is this funding already there? And if so, will it cover out-of-state tribes that have cases in California? Or is it just for California?
So really good question, and I'm going to repeat it. I don't know, just for the other side of the room as well. So Mark's question is, and make sure I get it right. I'm going to try to reduce it down to, is there funding for out-of-state tribes to be able to have legal counsel in California? So at CTFC, we did a strategic plan to try to understand, right, that there are barriers conceptually to evening the playing field. We have to break those barriers in a very strategic way. The goal is, yes, that, right, because, for example, why are there so many Native people from out of California that are in California? By and through federal policy. The federal government should bring resources to those people, because the federal government is the reason that they are away from their tribe and that their kids have grown up away from their tribe. So ultimately, the answer is absolutely, there has to be. That is getting to that even playing field. There's nothing in federal statute, and there's nothing in question 31 that Jack mentioned that says that that's impossible. It simply hasn't been done. So we've got to break down the barriers that the federal government kind of puts in the way and say, no, this is how it's going to work. But always when you're doing kind of needle shifting work, you have to be strategic, one step at a time. And so the project, as we see it here in California, taking the example from Alaska, you know, as an example, right? Taking what's working, for example, there, looking at the landscape of California, being strategic in a phased approach, that we will first break down the barrier for California tribes with a goal that out-of-state tribes, at some point, there's going to need to be a very diligent conversation about non-federally recognized tribes. There's going to need to be a very diligent conversation about probate, right? We have the whole hidden foster care question. We've got to have a diligent conversation about that. You've got to have a conversation about what happens when that case gets into tribal court, right? Because one success of having legal counsel in state court is that case ends in state court and ends up in tribal court. So there's conversations around what it looks like to have appropriate advocacy in tribal court. So there's no barrier, number one, to answer your question. And number two, the answer is yes, that is a goal as long as we get there in that strategic way. So I hope that answers your question. Okay.
Thank you for an excellent question. Yes.
So And I found myself in a situation where, you know, I've done as the advocate, and legal counsel and bring food. And so how do we access that? You know, like right now, the work that they work for, they represent 5 different tribes, and their level of need and their level of resources higher than the process. And so how do that?
Right.
So that it's not one of those right we need it for every case, for every tribe, for you know, any sense of how. But to have that, you know, well, they option of here and that, you know, over there. How? I mean, is it a brand thing or
Right.
I'm not up to speed. I apologize. Uninformed question.
No.
That would be a hard question to summarize. Could everybody hear that though on the other end of the room? Okay, so then we don't have to summarize that, but thank you for a great question. I'm going to assume, Kimberly, that's probably yours still. You okay? Also on the floor? Yes, okay. Maybe.
Wait, I'm sorry? Oh, for folks online, I will
Oh, for
summarize.
folks online, sorry. Essentially it was how can she access this resource that works with 5 tribes, right? A consortium of 5 tribes, to the consortium of 5 tribes, and they don't necessarily, and often they're not heard in a case the way they want to be, and so they want to know how they can get legal counsel into those cases and when they need them. Is that a fair summary? Okay, thanks. So, I don't know, Chairperson Will, do you want to answer this first? Okay.
Okay, so back in February, we actually did what we call the launch of the Legal Counsel for Tribes project. And conceptually what we laid out was the state through different funding sources, right? So as we've seen that this budget year in California, there is an incredible surplus in the California budget, which is great, right? That's wonderful. We're thrilled for the state of California that there's a budget surplus. So we've looked, okay, maybe there's some state funding that could come. There's also question 31 and the concept of federal funding, right? There's definitely a sense that if the federal government is opening doors for parents and kids to have legal counsel, then there's an obligation for them to make that available to tribes. So let's just say there's other funding sources. Okay, so there's a bundle of funding that's available. So CTFC went to the state and said, this is a problem and we need to have funding for it. And as a tribal organization, we are asking to move forward a budget ask. And we have Assemblymember Ramos who has sponsored a bill. And if that funding comes through, if the funding from the state comes through, then that's the pot of money that will stand up this project, okay? Now, the question is, then who can receive services from this project? And we're all super familiar. In fact, many of us have worked at California Indian Legal Services. Like we know what resource CILS offers. And by the way, CILS is, it's where I grew up as a lawyer. It's an incredibly important program in California. It does a whole spectrum of Indian law, right? So CILS does fantastic work in a lot of places. CTFC was founded by tribal leaders, yourself included, Angie, to do one thing, only one, and that's the Indian Child Welfare Act. And I'm speaking for myself right now. The Indian Child Welfare Act and advocacy for Native families and kids deserves that singular attention. It's that important. And so CILS does great work. CTFC does great work. Lots of folks are doing amazing work in the field, right? And no taking away from all of that work. In fact, we move the needle when we all collaborate. So this is an opportunity for more collaboration. So CTFC said, okay, this is what it looks like to fill the gap in California. It's very difficult to know a dollar amount to fill the gap for those tribes that don't have legal representation available. It's really tough. Why is it so tough? The data that California has put out has, for example, you look at the CCWIP, that's the California Child Welfare Index. I can't remember what the P is for right now. Project. It's going to be program project or something like that. Right. For 2021, the data just came out, and it says that in California, there are 1,100 ICWA cases, 1,100 in the state of California. I'm guessing most of you think that number sounds a little low, right? I remember having conversations with folks where the county would say there are, 30 cases. We have 30 cases in our county, and having a tribal representative say, "Are you kidding me? I have 40 cases, and I'm only one of several tribes in the county." The data is extremely low. I'm going to give you one example of why it's so low. I feel like I'm going way beyond the scope of the question, and I apologize.
More is better.
Okay, great. Why is that? Why is the CCWIP data so low? It comes out of the state's federal system. Man, I totally am speaking an acronym here, but the CMS-CWS, which is the data system the state uses for, it's where the social worker sits down, opens a computer, enters data, right, about a family. It's the main data system. If a social worker, for example, says that a child is Hispanic, that child cannot be anything else. So any child in California who is accurately represented in that data system as Hispanic can never be Native. We know in California, a majority of Native kids are multiracial, have multiple connections to multiple communities. And so we lose all those kids. That's one hit that the system has. Another, which I find incredibly fascinating and super discouraging, is that when we're looking, for example, at the doing the AFGARs, we spoke about the AFGAR system earlier. This is a federal data set. Well, California's been great as the federal government has pushed away from doing native data points in the national data system. The state of California said, we're going to adopt those data points. We're going to actually do it. And so there's been a ton of work, and some of you in this room have probably been on those extremely long meetings about the AFGARs data set, right? In going through that data system, it turns out that a social worker at the county can skip the inquiry data screen and keep moving. And upwards, I don't know the exact number, but my recollection is 50, in some counties, 50% of the cases the social worker skips identifying if the child is Native or not. Now, why do they do that? Because maybe at the moment they're in that screen, they don't know, and they're like, oh, I'll come back to it. They don't go back and they don't fill that in. And then that data miss means that we don't have data at the state. So if I had to guess how many kids in the state, what I've done in my head is I've taken what the state says at 1,100 for 2021, and I think that's upwards of 4,000. I think you take that by a multiple of 4 or 3, that amount. But anyways, it's closer to that. So what does it take to be available to that number of cases? And then how do you factor out, for example, at the outset, the out-of-state cases? There's no way. The data becomes completely unruly. And so what we've done as a program is said, if we're going to solve this problem and create this even playing field, we have to find resources that are going to make it possible to do that. This is paradigm shifting work. It takes a lot of resources. So when we took this concept to tribal leaders, some of whom are in the room, thank you, and to legislators, we said, we don't have solid enough data, but we need to shift this paradigm. They said, okay, then let's talk about what the resources are. What does it take? Now, let's say we get those resources. Maybe let's say that those resources come down. Then we say, all right, if we have this resource, we need to deploy it. First, we have to develop it. Right now, there are not enough, as Chairwoman Bill mentioned, there's not enough attorneys in the state of California. They just don't exist. They just aren't, that are super skilled. They're working at CILS. Some of the best and the brightest are at CILS. Some of then the other best and the brightest former CILS who are in private practice. And we probably know them all. It's a pretty small group. So we have to develop that. So that's kind of phase one, is developing that cadre of attorneys and hopefully working super closely with law schools to develop those attorneys to come up and be that resource. And the next is deploying regionally, for example. So where do we go regionally? How do we scale up? And so we've spent a ton of time thinking about that. The one challenge is that this is an ever-shifting landscape. For example, I mentioned all of a sudden the state of California has a surplus. maybe we don't wait for the federal government to figure out how federal funds flow, and maybe we go to the state government and figure it out that way. So we have tried to be agile to solve the problem. So very roundabout way of saying CTFC is accessing funds that Indian country needs and is entitled to. We will make that resource available as quickly as we possibly can. We will break the barrier, make the resource available, and then every tribe has the ability to say, we need assistance. That's the goal. And as was stated earlier, some tribes will say, we support this because every bad appeal from a small tribe that's under-resourced affects a tribe that, every single tribe, right? It's not a matter of the haves and have-nots in this. A bad appeal affects everybody. And so those tribes that would go without a resource, great. Those tribes that have their own resource, great. Every tribe, every child, every case, in whatever way it takes to make it happen, is the goal.
Like to add to that?
So just to answer the question specifically for my tribe, not necessarily the LC4T project, but what we've done, as I said, we transitioned from just having ICWA advocates representatives to now having legal counsel, and some of the resources we utilized was our ICWA advocates themselves. They've been in court cases against legal counsel on the opposite side, and we've been working with legal counsel, so we utilized their experience, and they presented to us a few names they'd like to see. And for myself, I knew a few people through me who also worked in this, but one struggle for us is where we live in a pretty rural area. And so a lot of our legal attorneys that we had made offers to didn't want to either move there to become in-house attorneys or anything like that. Yes, we saw that this was a need, but we just couldn't get people to us. So we had to make the decision to contract them. And so we have law firms that we utilize because we don't have just ICWA cases solely in California. We also have some in other states. So for us, the more national law firm was the best bet. So that we won't have to keep picking and choosing where's many of those states choose. We did. Another thing we're hoping to do is that we have we want to expand our own legal departments so that we can recruit more legal attorneys or more attorneys to see us in that way. Actual legal department, the people can find to come out there and work with us. I know that was from the main things to just be in our own capacity, and some attorneys not wanting to leave their law firms to come and work with us. Those are just some of the challenges in how we.
Other questions? Oh,
Something you could said first. So, this is the legislation, you mentioned about having cases outside of the state. It was focused on California side, no matter where they're at, or it's focused on California.
okay, so So for people online, the question is this focused on California tribes only within California, or also California tribes, the children of California tribes located elsewhere? Is that correct?
So for CTFC purposes, that phased approach first is California tribes with kids in cases in California. And then as we phase and there's capacity and there's collaboration, then the goal is out-of-state tribes with cases in California. And then eventually this is a national model. And eventually there's a legal counsel for tribes waive so that state by state, the federal government is not off the hook and or the state government must fund, right? So the goal would be, for example, that if it's Washoe, let's use as, right? And they've got a case in Nevada, there is an LC4T kind of project in Nevada, and that's the solution. But this has to be in a phased and methodical approach. And so, and then, for example, I'm always hopeful that we'll get some better law on delinquency cases. And so like, hey, let's put delinquency cases in the end of that, right? Let's start having legal counsel in those cases. Let's put non-federally recognized tribes under the under SB 678 conceptually. Let's see what that looks like. But the starting point, California tribes in California, and very likely in order to scale in the right way, and this is also from talking with Alex up in Alaska, and something that Chairman Bill mentioned, geography is a really big piece of how to successfully have legal counsel in place. So COVID created a very unique opportunity. So many courts started to build muscle around remote appearances. And we see an opportunity to jump on that and so utilize fewer resources to have more connection. And I know, advocates as well, right? Appearing by Zoom. So you're not spending 2 days in transit, right? And that's both good for us as human beings because we have lives, but it also means that we can do more work. So utilizing the circumstances on the ground over and over again, trying to extract the best out of the current circumstances, super, super important. But we're already seeing now, for example, Riverside County, no remote appearances. They're not on Zoom anymore. They barely did Zoom at all. So what that means is you've got to have someone who's willing to go there. Now, Riverside County, not so difficult to get attorneys, but Del Norte, pretty hard. Madera, not as hard, but so looking, every single county has its own attributes. There's also like different counties. If you look at the appeals, you can track appeals by county as well. Very interesting to see where the appeals are coming from. So that becomes another factor in analyzing what it looks like to scale the project. Alex made the point that Anchorage is where they're seeing so many kids not in ICWA compliant placements. And so thinking about that, that's the urban center of Alaska. That informs our thinking about where we need to be and what it looks like to have the highest impact. So again, paid by the word, sorry. Long answer to a short and concise question, but thank you.
I just add that this isn't a total answer by any means, but in a number of states, they are changing their rules about pro hoc vice representation. So for those of you who don't know what pro hoc vice is, it's basically when you're an out-of-state attorney, you're not licensed in the state, but you're coming in from outside to represent somebody. And typically when someone comes in from out of state, they have to affiliate themselves with a local attorney, they have to pay fees and all of that. So in a number of states, there's movement to sort of, in the child welfare cases, to do away with that. You don't need to associate with a local attorney, you don't need to pay fees. If you have a tribal attorney that's licensed, generally it's state licensed, it would be like a tribal bar, but the state licensed attorney that you want to send into that other state, they will allow those attorneys to appear just as is. And I know I've just been working on one of those rules in Colorado where I live, and I think there's about half a dozen, 6 or 7 states now that have this for equal cases. So not quite an answer, but a small part of the answer maybe.
We actually passed legislation in California to allow out-of-state attorneys to represent tribes in the state of California, but that was just not even.
So I just got slipped a note that the audio is through the laptop. So I have a sinking feeling that folks online, we apologize to all of you that you've not had an easy time hearing the conversation. So we'll move the laptop around a little bit as we let's see, what time is it? We have a little bit more time. Good. Okay. Can I just make one kind of, I promised that I would mention this. There is a group of attorneys in California and advocates actually who are, to Chairwoman Bill's point, advocating for the California State Bar to actually create, there's a series of, I think they call them committees in California. There's like lawyers that do real estate and lawyers that do criminal law and lawyers that do environmental law. And there's a movement afoot to create a subcommittee within the California State Bar structure of lawyers that do Indian law. And we've been working, in fact, one of the attorneys who's been spearheading it is an attorney with the California Department of Social Services who sees a tremendous need on a number of fronts. One, that's how you get more people to understand that Indian law is a thing. That's how you get people to understand that when they're practicing, let's say, real estate law or criminal law or environmental law or elder law, that there is a layer that could be Indian law that is implicated. And it's a movement toward getting Indian law on the California bar exam, which I know Chairman Bill has mentioned. And so there's a movement afoot, and we want to take advantage of that movement that is happening to bring Indian law as a practice and as a discipline forward. And creating visibility is a really big part of that. The invisibility, so I've been practicing Indian law for really, really long time. And I have had the experience of walking into courtrooms and have judges go, you know, what? ICWA? Indian law? Like, not really getting it. That doesn't really happen anymore. It used to a lot. Now there's visibility. And that's really powerful. So continuing to build on that visibility is, I think, really key to making sure that the concept of tribal sovereignty is understood in courtrooms. That's key, that the concept of tribal sovereignty is understood by bench officers and all that are involved. And there's also a little bit of what I kind of like to call it the fear factor, which is if you're a bench officer and over again, these loud, bossy folks keep coming into your courtroom over and over again. You have Angie Arroyo going into court and saying no, and next to her, with her, partnering with her is a lawyer, and partnering with them is a tribal leader. That bench officer is eventually going to get it. And the county council is eventually going to get it. But that's that visibility. That's them realizing that, oh, wow, like I can't just kind of roll. I have to pay attention. This voice is a rising tide. And then that means that when the next case comes along and there isn't an Angie Arroyo and there isn't a lawyer and there isn't a tribal leader, hopefully there is still some understanding and some recognition and that visibility, and you don't have the head kind of tilt and the question about Indian law. That's one of the hopes. Question?
Any other questions for the panel? I just mentioned real quickly what Chairperson Bill talked about getting equal courses into law schools. If you're ever advocating for that, there's now a case book that can be used that Kate Ford, or somebody you may know, has authored. I'm trying to remember if is it called Native Children in the Law or some, I think that's the name of it. So there's no excuse now. There's actually a case book that they can use for equal courses in law schools. So John mentioned that. Did you want to add something?
The other thing I'm going to mention is, when we're talking about education and law school, encouraging them to go to law school, whether it's helping them with LSAT fees, law school fees, anything like that. That's another other way that we're supporting our own. Obviously, it doesn't mean that they necessarily have to come back and be our tribal ICWA attorney, although I wish that they would. At least, we're putting more of our own into the field. And I think that that's also a big part of this, is at least if we have more of our own in the legal field, more ICWA compliance, I think, would be assured to happen. So just another plug for tribal leaders if you're not already providing those avenues. For those who might not necessarily have the resources to cover expenses and things like that, even providing the knowledge, even providing the information and the encouragement to go, sometimes is enough for our students to take that opportunity and apply.
Yeah, there's some research about Native students, first generation students, and other law students of color that when they graduate, they have so much student debt that they find themselves having to go into the highest paid position and don't have the ability to go back and work in their community. And that's one thing that at CTFC we're actually working on. How do we create the ability to have students have student loan debt repayment so that they can step into Indian law in a way that they get to remain in the community and they're not drowning in that debt. And that's not for all law students, right? There's tribes that have been incredibly generous. There are foundations that are incredibly generous, but we can't risk even one Native law student who says, I'm going to go and do tax law because I have student loans. I mean, I don't wish tax law on anybody anyways, but especially not some smart, amazing, ASU, Michigan law school, one of these great programs. Oh my goodness. No, we need them. We need them working for all of you.
We have a time check here. So,
It is 3:08.
okay, so we have 7 minutes left. So time for one more fantastic question or 2 mediocre questions. Yes.
Not a question, my leader, I was speak for the travel eligible for enrollment, we talked about experience hospital, the judge or everything moved on to another public club, like kind of there. And I kind of say, it's gonna be a burden on the state, try to be careful, if you know it. Trust fund, have education, housing, health insurance. Was a battle back and forth. They want to nobody making sovereign doctors and we're not winning with a real emotional stress. Kid at the time, your parents a lot of church to step up. At that time, it started. Education for the state, a lot of this and all right. 18 months on the reservation. After that, I really went to the people I knew that the 80 miles they all of that. Slipped right through the crack. Before I had to be more special people.
Yeah.
And more tribal leaders than what you did.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. Oh, yeah. So Chairwoman Bill mentioned that, are you talking about the attorney advisory? Yeah. So another resource that was put into place in part by tribal leaders who stood up CTFC is that, number one, we are a resource that we're available. We try to be available. So for example, you heard earlier about preparing model letters for things, putting out resources that help make everybody else's job a little easier. But one thing that we do, and I'm kind of laughing because it's actually really fun, is we have a once-a-month attorney advisory committee meeting. And what we do is bring attorneys together on Zoom. It's on Fridays. Is that right, on Fridays? Wednesdays, but it's like the 4th Wednesday of the month, and we start at 3 p.m. and we go till 5, and it gets punchier and punchier as we get closer to 5 o'clock. And what the attorney advisory committee does is it allows attorneys working in this space to come together and to brainstorm and to think and to problem solve. And so what we try to do, what CTFC does, is bring that resource so that the practitioners have a place to go to say, hey, I have something that I'm wondering about. And CTFC has a partnership with UCLA Law School, specifically with the San Manuel Tribal Development Clinic. And it's been a really terrific partnership. So we give those students assignments and they give them back to us. And then we go and actually have guest taught that clinic with the students, which is super fun. And so recently at one of our attorney advisory committee meetings, we had a student from UCLA dig into a really tough issue, de facto parent status. What does it mean? Why does it exist? It's not a statute. It's this judge-made concept that a person who has certain attributes can be given party status in a case. Now, there's some ways that's actually reminiscent of ICWA, right? Like you think Indian custodians, a person who has a role with a child that's not legally recognized, sounds kind of good. How de facto parent status unfortunately often presents itself is, for example, and I'm very much generalizing here, and this is just kind of what I've seen in my practice, but non-native grandparents who hire up a lawyer and say, we want our grandkid. And they go armed, they go, mano a mano, hand-to-hand combat with the tribe. And so we asked this UCLA law student to do some research on this issue, help us understand it. Where did it come from? What are the real rules? What are other states doing? And what we got was a presentation looking across the United States dissecting de facto parent concepts in every state in the United States. Which ones work? How do they conflict with ICWA? That work will then inform our next legislative agenda. We may do a bill next year that clarifies de facto parent status, or we may do a bill next year that says de facto parents can't exist inside an ICWA case. We don't know for sure what the direction will be, but the point is that by engaging with these law students, by engaging with UCLA, we bring this resource to the Attorney Advisory Committee. We have a space where folks can share. Everybody's invited, and we problem solve really proactively. And a byproduct of that is now we have a law student from UCLA who said, "Can I come and work with you guys?" Which is really cool. So it's creating a kind of an ecosystem where we're putting out the welcome mat to say, come and get in community with us, and let's figure out how we problem solve. If we don't proactively problem solve, all we will do is fight off the next Rakhine. We've got to figure out a way to be proactive. We can't always be on the defensive. Thank you.
One last opportunity. Going once, going twice. Yes.
Probably more of a clerical question. How many of the goals that Frank can ask for if they want to ask? However, I think as most of us have, there's a lot of resources out there for Frank, a lot of options for when it's utilized because private and so when I think about you telling us that we will be able to ask for that at some point, if you follow the text that probably don't have here and maybe are made aware of that. So is it a long-term goal going to be that it's just an automatic thing offered like as retention, or will it always be that we have to ask for it? And how do you go about making sure that all the tribes, especially the little ones, are aware of this?
Great question.
So the question in a nutshell was, right now it's presented that tribes would have to ask for this service. Will it ever be made more automatic so that the small tribes will not have to seek it out?
Yeah. So, great question. And I would be so thrilled with the day that every bench officer in the state of California says, "You're a tribe? I want to be sure that you have all the resources you need. Let's have a conversation." That would be amazing. I will take a baby step though and say that CTFC takes it upon itself to be sure that we are projecting out there, making sure that as an organization we are known. I know CILS does a ton of work. They have a website. They put out there that they're available. So the goal would be that tribes are aware that this is a resource, not only a resource that's available, but they are deserving of, right? That it's a resource they can access. We also know, and you said something really important, which is that so many times there are resources for tribes and they seem unattainable. So many times the federal government and the state as well, and counties, it's like, hey, we've got this project, but the tribe would have to have an accountant, an auditor, a director, all these resources in order to access. And let's say it's a 50-50 match. The tribe has to put matching funds on the table. That makes it unattainable. There's no use in that. So our goal is to make sure that as we launch this project, it's incredibly easy to access. It's very well known. And Delia, can I mention the app? Okay. And it turns out that websites aren't the best way to communicate with people, according to my teenagers. So what you do now, it turns out, is you have an app. And so we are in the throes of figuring out a project to develop an app. Jack knows about this project and we're super excited. And what that will do is create a resource in what is in everybody's hand, right? Not your laptop, your phone. So being aware, boots on the ground, as an advocate is in the courtroom and says, uh-oh, we want to be sure that there's a resource in their hand. Now, you can't provide legal advice directly through a phone. That's a little bit problematic, right? What you can do is you can say there's a resource, there's access, there's folks who will want to answer questions for you, and there's folks who want to partner with you. And so that's another way of making sure that the resource is known. It's one building block. There's lots of steps to be taken, but we are very aware that it's as important to have the resource as to make sure that tribes and tribal advocates know that there's a resource and that it's accessible. So I think that's it.
All right, well, thank you to the panel for, oh, we have one more question. Go ahead. We'll stay as long as you guys want until they kick us out. So go ahead.
So I know it's Johnson. You know about, and so I don't know the number of times. But in order to access that representation, must those tribes be a part of it.
So the question is, how many tribes are part of CFTC, and do you have to be a member to teach? CTFC, I messed that up. And how many, and does a tribe need to be a member to access the resources?
Okay. So right now, I want to be sure, as of yesterday, we're at 50 tribes and 3 statewide tribal leader organizations and the California Tribal Chairmen's Association. And we are, what we imagine, right? The goal is every tribe, every case, every tribe. That's the goal. So we will advocate and are advocating for resources that can be made available across the state for every tribe. But I do want to preface to say that there's no fee to join CTFC. There's no annual donate. There's no barrier to joining. So every tribe should be able to join. And I'm going to harken back to some of my comments this morning. Part of what makes an organization like CTFC work is being able to have that united voice. So the power of those numbers, it's why we don't, for example, have barriers to joining, right? But we also recognize that there will be tribes that say we're not going to join CTFC, and we want to be sure that the resource is available to them. So when we go to the state, when we talk about what needs to be fixed, we're not saying it only needs to be fixed for a small group of tribes or a medium group of tribes or a grouping of tribes. It's every sovereign nation needs to have those resources, and we will advocate. We do advocate, and we'll continue to advocate for that. So the really quick answer is no. A tribe does not have to be a member of CTFC to access the LC4T resources.
I say one last thing on that.
Oh, yes.
Sorry.
I was going to say, tribal leaders or tribes do not have to be members. They really should be. So just want to clarify that for the tribal leaders experience. We recently joined within this past year when we got on council, we joined, and we just get so many resources and so many good information that I would just suggest that any tribal leader in this room, please check to ensure that you are a member of CTFC, and that's just based on my personal experience with the organization.
I will recognize it.
Thank you for being in there.
Thank you for all the questions. Super appreciate it.
I'm gonna go ask Andy all kinds of questions over there.
Totally.
Isn't she on the next panel?
All right.